Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great. So you've sent us a ton of research on student voice in UK higher education.
Yeah.
Looks like we're going to try to figure out how much power students really have in universities.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. The whole higher education landscape in the UK has changed so dramatically over the past 2 decades.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It wasn't that long ago that university was practically free for students.
Right. Taxpayers basically footed the bill.
But now it's all about tuition fees and loans.
Huge shift.
It feels like students are kind of treated like customers these days.
In a way, yeah.
But is that really empowering them? Or is there something else going on beneath the surface? That's what we're going to explore. This research actually lays out 4 different ways to look at student voice, and each one adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It's really interesting stuff. So, where do we start?
Let's start with the first one, the idea that universities might be controlling student feedback, kind of like in high school.
Yeah. It's called appropriating student voice, and it's all about how institutions encouraged feedback, but only within certain boundaries.
Okay, like they want to hear from students, but only on their terms.
Exactly. Remember being in high school?
Oh, yeah?
You could maybe complain about the food in the cafeteria, but could you really challenge how things were run? Or question the curriculum?
Probably not. So how does this play out at the university level?
Well, there's this research from 2001 by Fielding,
Okay.
and it poses some thought-provoking questions about how schools, and by extension universities, might be subtly controlling the narrative. Questions like who gets to speak, who's actually listening, what topics are deemed acceptable for discussion.
Interesting.
It highlights this dynamic where institutions say they value student feedback, but only if it fits within their predetermined parameters.
So not outright censorship, but more like shaping the conversation in a way that benefits the institution.
Precisely. It reminds me of Foucault's ideas about the disciplinary machine. The subtle forces that shape our behavior without us even realizing it.
Oh, that's a good point. And a perfect example of that in action is the National Student Survey, right? The NSS.
Exactly.
I remember filling that out. It felt like a big deal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like the university really cared what we thought. But now I wonder if it was more about them wanting to look good,
Yeah.
boost their rankings.
Right. And the problem is that this focus on the NSS can actually distort student voice.
In what way?
Well, universities might prioritize superficial improvements just to boost their scores, instead of addressing those deeper issues that students really care about.
So the very tool that's supposed to empower students, the NSS, might actually be silencing them in a way.
It's a real possibility. And it leads us to the second way of looking at student voice, which is the concept of regulatory capture.
Oh, yeah, that one sounds a bit intimidating.
It's from economics, and it basically means that sometimes those organizations that are supposed to regulate an industry can end up serving the interests of that industry instead of the public good.
Okay, can you give me a real-world example? I'm not an economist.
Sure, imagine a football match.
Okay.
The referees are supposed to be impartial, right?
Yeah.
But they keep making calls that favor one team over the other. And it turns out they've become really close with the owners of that team. They're essentially doing their bidding. That's kind of like what can happen with regulatory capture.
Okay. Got it. So who are the referees and the teams in higher education?
Well, you have the universities themselves, of course, and the government agencies that fund them, and then the student unions, which are supposed to represent the students' interests.
And the concern is that these groups can get too cozy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the students' needs end up getting lost in the mix.
Almost like a revolving door.
You got it. People might start out working for a student union, then move to a government agency, and then end up in a leadership position at a university.
And their loyalties might become a bit blurred along the way.
It's a real possibility. And it makes it harder for students to have their voices heard, especially if they're raising concerns that might upset the established order.
It's starting to sound like a conspiracy theory.
Well, it's not about assuming malicious intent. It's more about recognizing that these power dynamics exist.
Yeah.
They can have a real impact on how student voice is expressed and received.
I see what you mean. It's like those optical illusions where your perception is influenced by the context. You might think you're seeing one thing, but the reality is much more complex.
Exactly. And a prime example of this is the National Union of Students, the NUS. They're supposed to be the main voice for students in the UK.
Right.
But they have a history of very close ties to the Labour Party.
Oh, wow. So are you saying that the NUS is just a puppet of the Labor Party?
Not necessarily. The NUS has done some really great work advocating for student rights.
Okay.
But it's also true that those political ties can influence their priorities and how they frame certain issues.
I see. So it's not a black and white situation.
Definitely not. It raises questions, though, about whether they're truly independent and whether they're representing the diverse views of all students.
I get your point. It's like anything involving politics. There are always different agendas at play.
And the key takeaway here is to be aware of those agendas and to think critically about who benefits from certain policies or practices.
So we've seen how institutions can subtly manipulate student voice and how power dynamics and political alliances can shape the conversation. But what about all those voices that never even make it to those formal channels? That's where this third perspective comes in, right? The irretrievable student voice.
That's right. This one is all about acknowledging the sheer vastness of the student experience and how much of it remains unseen and unheard.
Okay, so like all those thoughts and experiences that students have that never get documented or formally expressed.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine trying to piece together a historical event from scattered artifacts. You can gather some evidence, you can get a glimpse of what happened, but so much remains lost to time.
So are you saying that any attempt to capture student voice is always going to be incomplete?
In a way, yes. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it's important to be aware of the limitations of our data, to recognize that there are so many experiences, thoughts, and feelings that never get formally articulated.
I never thought about it that way.
It's like those quiet students in the back of the class, the ones who might have brilliant insights but never raise their hands.
Yeah, and we only see those ones. What about the students who never even come to class? The ones struggling with things we don't even know about?
Those are the ones whose voices are even harder to capture, but they're just as important.
Okay, so what can we do? How can we tap into those unvoiced perspectives if we can't rely on surveys and feedback forms?
It's tricky. By definition, these voices are often hidden or unspoken. We can try to create spaces where students feel safe to express themselves, more informally.
So, like casual conversations or focus groups, maybe even creative outlets like art or music.
Yes. It's about providing a platform for those voices that might not fit neatly into those boxes of official feedback mechanisms.
And this challenges that whole student as consumer metaphor, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That metaphor oversimplifies the relationship between the student and the university.
It does. A customer buys a product, and if it's faulty, they can return it. A student's experience is so much more than that.
So much more. It's about personal growth,
Mm.
intellectual exploration, forming relationships, navigating challenges, and ultimately shaping one's identity.
And you can't capture that on a satisfaction survey, can you?
You can't. And unlike a dissatisfied customer, a student can't just return their degree if they're unhappy with the experience.
It's a huge decision, way more complex than buying a faulty product.
Exactly. And that's why that consumer metaphor falls short. It doesn't capture the true complexity of being a student.
Right. It makes me think about the Student Room website.
Oh, interesting.
Have you spent any time on there?
Of course. It's like a digital town square for students across the UK.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of how students find their own ways to be heard, right? Outside of those official channels. It's raw and unfiltered, and often anonymous, which I think allows for a different kind of honesty.
You're so right. It's a reminder that student voice can emerge in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from those informal peer-to-peer interactions.
Okay, so we've talked about how institutions can control student voice, how power dynamics can silence it, and how so much of it remains unseen and unheard. And that brings us to the fourth perspective, which, to be honest, kind of blew my mind.
You're talking about non-representational theory, NRT.
Yeah, it's a whole different way of thinking about student voice that goes beyond just words and opinions.
It can seem a bit abstract, I know, but it's actually quite simple once you get the hang of it.
So instead of asking, what do students think?
We ask, what do students do? It's about shifting our attention to their actions, behaviors, everyday practices.
Oh, I see. So, like, instead of relying on those formal feedback mechanisms, we should observe how students navigate the university environment.
You got it. And it can be very revealing.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine observing students in a lecture hall. Are they taking notes, whispering to each other, scrolling on their phones? All of these actions tell a story, even if they never say a word.
Right. Right. It's not just about what students say they think or feel. It's about how they act.
Mm.
And those actions can reveal a lot about their experiences.
And the power dynamics at play, too.
Oh, for sure. Think about a student representative attending a committee meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Is she really engaged in the discussion, truly representing her peers? Or is she just there to check a box on her CV?
It's a good question. NRT encourages us to look beyond the surface,
Yeah.
to analyze those subtle actions and motivations.
So are you suggesting we should be observing students in their natural habitat, kind of like those nature documentaries?
Kind of. It's about becoming more attentive to those subtle cues, the unspoken narratives that are always there.
This reminds me of something I read about the difference between what students do and what they ought to do. Like there's this gap between their actual behavior and the expectations placed on them by the university.
It's a great observation, and that gap can be really telling.
Right. Oh, okay. I think I'm starting to get this now. It's like those forensic scientists who can reconstruct an entire crime scene by analyzing tiny details. NRT is kind of like that. It helps us see those hidden narratives, those unspoken truths that might be just as important, if not more so, than the official feedback and pronouncements.
Exactly. And the beauty of NRT is that it can be applied to all sorts of situations, not just formal settings. We can use it to analyze student behavior in classrooms, online, in social spaces, everywhere.
This is giving me a whole new way to look at my own university experience.
Yeah.
It's like I'm suddenly seeing things I never noticed before, even though they were always there.
That's the power of these different perspectives. They
Yeah.
help us to see things in a new light.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. These 4 ways of looking at student voice, appropriating student voice, regulatory capture, the irretrievable student voice, and NRT have given me a much better understanding of how student voice operates in higher ed. But I'm still left wondering.
Wondering what?
Well, we've talked about all the problems, the power dynamics, the limitations.
Right.
But where are the solutions? Is there any hope for actually creating a system where student voice is truly valued and where students have real influence on decisions?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for that.
Stay tuned. So we've seen how student voice can be kind of like twisted and how power dynamics can make it hard for students to actually be heard, you know? But what about the experiences that never even make it into those official channels? Like, that's where this idea of the irretrievable student voice comes in.
Right, like we're looking at just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
And now we're realizing there's this whole massive structure underneath that we can't even see.
A whole underwater world.
It really makes you think, like, how much are we actually missing?
Yeah.
All those thoughts and feelings and experiences that students have that never get, talked about or written down.
Yeah, it's not just about individual students being quiet either. Like, you have to think about those bigger social and cultural forces that kind of shape how students express themselves, you know?
So, like, even if a student wants to speak up, they might not because of, I don't know, social norms or pressure from their peers.
Exactly.
Or even worry about how their feedback will be, received.
Yeah, there are so many layers to this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really stuck with me from this research was this question that Crowley asked. He's done a lot of work on children's participation in society. And he asks, is anybody listening? And it's such a powerful question, because it really applies to higher education as well, right? Like, we have all these systems for gathering student feedback, but are we actually listening? Or are we just going through the motions?
It's kind of like we're just ticking boxes
Yeah.
and collecting data,
Right.
but not actually engaging with what students are saying.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to actually listen with an open mind
Yeah.
and to truly hear what students are saying, even when it's, challenging or uncomfortable.
It's tough.
Yeah.
And, even when we are listening, are we really hearing what's being said? Or are we kind of filtering it through our own biases?
Yeah, right.
Like, we hear what we want to hear.
Yeah. We all have to be aware of that,
Yeah.
It takes real effort to set aside our own assumptions and try to see things from the student's point of view.
And this is all making me think about the limitations of this student as consumer idea again.
Yeah, for sure.
It's so oversimplified, don't you think?
It is.
Like, a customer buys a product, and if it's not good, they can just take it back. But a student's experience is so much more than that.
It's more. Yeah.
It's about, growing as a person, developing their intellect, figuring out their place in the world.
Right. All those things.
And you can't really measure that on a survey, can you?
No, Not really.
Like if a student isn't happy with their experience, they can't just like return their degree, right?
No.
It's a big decision with big consequences.
Exactly.
I mean, it's kind of like the difference between, I don't know, buying a pair of shoes and getting married.
Ah, yeah, good analogy.
The stakes are a bit higher, right?
For sure.
So treating students like customers, I don't know, it feels kind of dismissive.
I agree.
Like it doesn't capture the whole picture.
Right, it just doesn't acknowledge the complexity of the student experience.
Yeah, and that makes me think about the student room again, you know?
Oh, yeah, good point.
It's such a good example of how students are creating their own spaces to talk about what's really going on. The good and the bad, you know?
Totally.
And because it's like mostly anonymous, they can be more honest
It's real, yeah.
and more vulnerable,
Yeah.
which you don't really get in a formal feedback setting, right?
Not really.
It's like this, I don't know, unfiltered look into student life.
Yeah, it's like reading those online reviews before you buy something, you know?
Yeah, it's the real deal.
You get the inside scoop.
Okay, so I think we've explored these first three lenses pretty well, and they really show how limited those traditional approaches to understanding student voice can be.
Yeah.
It's like we've been trying to solve a puzzle with the wrong pieces.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why this fourth lens is so interesting. It kind of introduces a completely new way of thinking about student voice.
Yeah.
One that goes beyond just like words and opinions
Right.
and looks at like actions and behaviors instead.
Is non-representational theory, right?
Exactly.
NRT.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, that one kind of confused me at first. It seemed so abstract.
I know, it can be a bit of a head scratcher, but it's really quite straightforward once you wrap your head around it.
So remind me again, instead of asking what do students think?
We ask, what do students do? It's about looking at their actions and their everyday activities.
Right. So like instead of analyzing what they say in a feedback survey, we should be observing how they, actually interact with the survey itself. Like, are they rushing through it? Are they distracted by their phone?
Yes, exactly. And those actions can tell us a lot.
Like what?
Like their level of engagement,
Yeah.
Their motivations, even the power dynamic they have with the university.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a bit like those sports commentators, They don't just talk about the score. They analyze all the moves and strategies that led to that outcome.
Right.
It's about looking deeper.
And if we use that same approach to analyze student behavior, we can get a much better understanding of their experience. This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the difference between what students do and what they ought to do.
Yeah.
Like there's this disconnect between their actions and what's expected of them.
And that gap can be really revealing, right?
It can.
Like if students are skipping lectures or not participating in online discussions, instead of just saying, oh, they're lazy or they don't care, we can use NRT to figure out the reasons behind those actions.
Yeah, like maybe the material isn't relevant, or maybe they just can't handle all the work.
Maybe they're totally overwhelmed,
Yeah.
or maybe the teaching just isn't very engaging. Who knows?
So if we understand why students are behaving a certain way, then we can come up with better solutions.
Exactly. Solutions that actually address their needs.
Okay, so NRT isn't just about observation. It's about taking action.
That's right. It's about using those observations to identify areas where we can make things better.
And challenge some of those assumptions we make about student behavior.
Right, like assuming that if students aren't participating in formal feedback, it's because they just don't care.
Yeah.
But NRT suggests there might be other things going on that we're not seeing.
Yeah. And maybe we need to be more creative, Like rethink how we approach student engagement altogether.
It's about thinking outside the box.
Totally.
And finding new ways to tap into those unspoken narratives and create spaces where students actually feel empowered to use their voices.
It's like this deep dive has opened up a whole new world for me.
Me too.
We start out just looking at student voice, but now we're looking at the whole system.
At all its complexities.
Yeah, the challenges, the power dynamics, but also the possibility for real change.
And the potential for students to really shape their own educational journeys.
Okay, so what do we do now? Like, we've uncovered all this stuff,
Yeah.
but how do we put it into action? How do we create a higher education system that actually values student voice and gives students real influence?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's the question we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
So we spent all this time, really digging into the whole idea of student voice in UK higher education.
Yeah, we've seen how it can get, manipulated or silenced, even just lost in, everything that goes on in a student's life.
We've talked about power dynamics and institutional structures, even those like unspoken things that influence how students experience university.
And now the question is, what do we do with all this?
Right. What do we do?
How do we take all this knowledge and actually make a difference?
That's what I'm wondering. It can feel kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we've identified all these problems.
Right.
But what are the solutions?
Well, I think there is definitely hope.
Okay, good.
Remember those 4 lenses we've been talking about?
Yeah.
Those aren't just for analyzing things,
Yeah.
They can also help us figure out how to change things for the better.
So, like, how do we use them to actually make a difference? Give me an example.
Okay, so, that first lens, the idea that universities can control student feedback. Knowing that, we can be more intentional about, creating spaces where students feel safe to speak their minds.
Okay.
So they can express themselves without worrying about being judged or penalized.
So instead of relying only on those official feedback channels, which the university kind of controls,
Right.
we should encourage more informal ways for students to talk and share their opinion.
Exactly. Think about student-run groups,
Right.
online forums, even creative stuff like art or music. It's about letting students create their own spaces for expression.
That makes sense. Okay, what about regulatory capture? How do we deal with all those relationships and potential conflicts of interest?
Transparency is key. We need to bring those relationships out in the open, make them visible, and hold those institutions accountable.
So making sure universities are transparent about how they're spending money and where their funding comes from.
Exactly.
And who's actually making decisions.
And we need to push for more student representation on those decision-making boards and committees. Students need to be part of the process from the beginning.
Right. Okay, I'm seeing how these lenses can really help us focus our efforts on making changes.
They can be a roadmap.
Yeah. Okay, but what about that third lens, the irretrievable student voice?
Yeah.
All those experiences that just fly under the radar. How do we even begin to address that?
That one's tricky because, we're dealing with stuff that's hidden, unspoken.
Right.
But I think the key is to just be more aware, more observant, to pay attention to, those subtle cues, those things that people aren't saying out loud.
So, instead of focusing only on what students are saying, we need to look at what they're doing.
Yeah, I get
how
it.
they're interacting with the university and environment, their peers, how they spend their time.
Exactly. And we need to create a culture where students feel like they can share those experiences, even the ones that are messy or hard to talk about.
That reminds me of what you said earlier about creating those safe spaces where students can talk informally without being judged. Seems like that's really important for tapping into those hidden voices.
It is. It requires everyone to shift their thinking, the institutions and the students themselves.
Okay.
We need to move away from this idea that feedback has to be super formal and, structured.
Quantifiable, yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes the most important insights come from those casual conversations.
Yeah.
Those little offhand comments, those moments when people are just being real with each other.
Makes sense. Okay, so we're being more attentive, creating those safe spaces. What about non-representational theory?
Yeah.
How do we actually use that one to make changes? It seems more like it's about observing than, doing something.
That's a common misunderstanding. NRT isn't just about sitting back and watching.
Okay.
It's about using those observations to figure out how to disrupt those ingrained practices that keep things unfair.
Cool.
Or silence people who disagree,
Yeah. So, for example, if we see students aren't really engaging with those formal feedback mechanisms, instead of just assuming they don't care,
Right.
we use NRT to try and figure out why.
Exactly.
What's preventing them from
And
participating?
what are the barriers?
Yeah.
And once we understand that, then we can try different things. Maybe we need to make those feedback processes more interesting.
Yeah, more interactive.
Or maybe it's about giving students more actual power to influence decisions that affect their lives.
It's like we're using NRT to, hack the system.
Huh. I like that.
Find those weak spots
Yeah.
where you can give students more agency.
Exactly.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We started with all this research on student voice,
Yeah.
and we've ended up looking at the whole system in a totally new way.
We've explored the challenges, the power dynamics, but also the amazing potential for positive change.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that students aren't just passive recipients of education. They have the power to shape their own experiences.
And shape the institutions they're part of.
Yeah. So for everyone listening out there, as you keep thinking about these ideas, remember those 4 lenses?
It can be really helpful.
Yeah, use them to question your assumptions
to challenge the way things are.
and fight for a better higher education system.
One that truly benefits everyone.
Keep asking those tough questions, keep listening, and keep diving deep.